Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at The Philosophy of Aristotle by D.J. Allan. This book was originally published in 1952, but I have here the second edition from 1970, which was a little bit revised in the areas of rhetoric and poetics and ethics. And so I think this is probably the preferred version. As in all my episodes, I'm going to read a few sections here. I want to read a little bit about nature and his physical and metaphysical studies. And then I want to read a little bit more about ethics and politics. This section on ethics and politics may just reiterate some of the things we saw in the previous two episodes. But that's okay. I want to reinforce some of these ideas, and I want it to be understood that they're not just the ideas of one particular author's interpretations, but these are the generally accepted interpretations of what Aristotle is saying. So, to start with, I want to talk about nature and what Aristotle means by nature. So here he says, quote, "The name physics means the study of nature, and it may be helpful to give a sketch of Aristotle's use of this word. It may mean, 1, the original state of a thing, as opposed to its state when modified by culture and education, and hence those tendencies in any growing thing which are first displayed, as opposed to others not less natural which come out at a later stage. And 2, the acme of development, which is reached when every inherent capacity has been brought out. These are two opposite but equally legitimate uses of the word, but it is not from either of these senses that the name of science is derived. Nature may also mean 3, the power of spontaneous movement and change, as opposed to movement which is induced from without or by force, and 4, the total aggregate of bodies which display such movement. It is with reference to these last two meanings that the name physics is appropriate. Besides this, Aristotle sometimes seems to regard nature as a designing power, which has provided every living being with those faculties which it needs in order to survive. He is never weary of calling attention to the marvelous accuracy and economy of her design. Passages like this suggest the view that nature is not merely an immanent force, but a person, having reason and foresight. He certainly criticizes other thinkers for trying to explain natural processes in mechanistic terms, and goes to an extreme length in the opposite direction. The fact is that he holds that a process may be purposive and yet not be the outcome of conscious choice. More on this subject below. It is evident, therefore, that physics is for him a science of vast extent, including not merely the whole theory of the inanimate world, but the study of living beings in all its aspects. It will comprehend what are now termed psychology, physiology, and biology, besides a great deal that still seems to belong to philosophy. Aristotle, of course, from time to time, indicates various subdivisions within the science, and he is far from supposing it to be complete in his own time." End quote. So here we get the basic idea that there's a few different ways of understanding the word nature. The first being the way something is understood, or the way something presents itself without having any influences upon it. This kind of sounds like Rousseau's natural man without any sort of civilizing, educational, cultural influences, just in a very primeval state. This is a natural thing. But also, he talks about the acme of something, so that something in its fullest development, bringing about its fullest capacities, would be the nature of a thing. And in this regard, you might say that man's nature is to be a reasoning creature, something in its brought to its fullness of inner capacity. The pinnacle of its own development is its true nature. Its nature is something that evolves, it springs into its nature, it enters into its true nature, as opposed to originating in its true nature. So those things are sort of opposed, but the author says that's not exactly what Aristotle's talking about when he talks about nature or physics. He's also talking about other meanings, which could be spontaneous movement and change. So if something does something on its own without being pushed in one direction or another, the nature of that thing is its own movement. So obviously, in our modern world, we understand that nothing really can just move on its own without any influence from anything else. But you might think about inertia. If an object is moving, it'll just keep moving at the same rate and in the same direction unless it's acted on by another force. Now, everything is always being acted on by other forces. This wasn't quite understood back in Aristotle's time, but you might think about the planets, right? The planets have their orbits. They just have a certain way of behaving that is an intrinsic motion. So the idea was that the planets have this intrinsic circular motion, or this intrinsic path of across the sky, and a process by which that they followed the stars moving around the sky, rotating around the world. This was the nature of the stars. The nature of animals is the way that they behave. The nature of a rock when it's released is to drop down. The nature of fire is to move upward. Things have natural movements on their own when they're not affected by anything else. So that's the sense of nature that we get when we begin to study physics. And then the last is the total aggregate of bodies which display such movement. So here you have nature as a whole, like the whole set of things in their own particular ways of being. This is nature, right? And here you can kind of say this includes everything, because everything has, especially in the Aristotelian view, where things have their own sort of natural movements, that everything is comprised of nature. But especially this includes living creatures that are capable of movement, are capable of action. And interestingly, we also get the idea that he's not really advocating for a mechanistic vision of the world. That everything is he doesn't advocate it for sort of just empty machine-like clockwork motion of things without any influence from some design. And so he has this odd position where he advocates that nature has sort of designed things, and yet we also get the statement here that that he says he holds that a process may be purposive and yet not be the outcome of conscious choice. So this is a sort of strange idea. This, of course, brings about the question whether or not Aristotle believed in the gods, because if he did, he might believe that Physis is a goddess with some sort of intention, some sort of idea for what she wanted the world to be like. The nature of things is something determined by Physis. And this, of course, makes Physis a preeminent goddess, one of the most powerful goddesses. This is a sort of variation of the traditional Olympian kingship of Zeus, the kind of basic mythology. There's I think in philosophy, there's a shifting and changing of the cosmology and the mythology and the arrangement of gods and goddesses and what their domains are and who is the superior or preeminent gods and goddesses. It seems to me that there's a sort of shift happening, and this is to some extent stepping back from the mythological explanations for things and moving more toward naturalistic explanations. But I also think that in a sense there's a elevating of certain gods and goddesses who oversee the natural world. And like when we talk about Physis and we personify Physis, we aren't too many steps away from considering Physis as some sort of being and a goddess, and the same thing with Ananke, the same thing with necessity. We talk about the necessity of things and the way the universe is structured, and necessity is this core component. And also we talk about, like with Empedocles, love and strife as these active forces in the world, moving things, bringing things together and splitting things apart. And love and strife are themselves goddesses, right? So we get all these concepts that have associated deities acting on the world. We don't hear much about Zeus, really. We don't hear much about the traditional gods and goddesses. We hear a lot about physis and Ananke, and we hear about some other gods and goddesses and that have sort of elevated roles in the ways of the world. So I'm not certain that there's a complete wiping out of mythology in these philosophers. I think there's a remnant of mythology, and it's a sort of changing and shifting of mythology. But also there is a step back clearly from basic mythological explanations of things. So let's jump to the next section when we get the classic discussion of the causes, the various causes that things can have. So here he says, quote, "It is the business of all science to discover causes, and Aristotle holds that an incomplete analysis of causation was not the least of the errors of the previous physicists. When we analyze some process of becoming, whether natural or artificial, 4 elements are found, each of which is necessary to a total statement of the cause. Form and matter must be distinguished because, as has been seen, they are components in every determinate thing. Thirdly, the source of change must be discovered, the efficient cause. Finally, one must name the end which the process is designed to achieve, the final cause. The points which Aristotle wishes to emphasize here are that there are no other factors in causation except these, and that the 4 factors are at least logically distinguishable, though in fact it is often the same thing which functions in more than one capacity. An example will show this. Asked to define a house, one might say it is a structure composed of stone, brick, glass, or similar materials so put together by a builder as to give lasting shelter to men and their goods. Physical science, according to Aristotle at least, is to give the same kind of explanation for all natural change. But now, form is, in such a case, equivalent to purpose. For we have no right to deny the name house to any structure which achieves the end mentioned in the definition. Further, Aristotle has an ingenious argument to show that if one pursues the analysis far enough, the true, efficient cause is likewise found to be the form. The process of building is initiated in the last resort by the science of building, present in the builder's mind, and including the form of the future house. It is obvious that, contrary to modern usage, Aristotle here includes component factors of the event as part of its cause. Provided this is recognized, there does not seem to be much to quarrel with in his analysis. But it does seem, to the reader of the Physics, to bulk too largely in Aristotle's account, and to distract attention from other problems which he does not treat with as much frankness and completeness as might be desired, namely, whether and in what parts of the world there are necessary sequences of cause and effect, such that some events are invariably followed by others, and whether we can, without opening the door wide to metaphysical speculation, suppose natural processes to be designed for an end. This brings us to the next topic. The 5th century had seen 2 systems, that of Empedocles and that of the atomists, which, however different in other respects, agreed in making a ruthless attempt to eliminate purpose from physical science, and to show that facts which appear to be products of design can and must be otherwise explained. On the other side, Anaxagoras appealed vaguely to a designing mind, which brought order out of chaos, and in which all sentient beings have a greater or less share. Diogenes of Apollonia inferred the existence of an intelligent cause of the world from the exquisite precision of the sense organs of living beings, and from the regularity of cosmic processes. He was the true founder of the argument from design. Plato developed this line of argument with reference to the astronomy and medicine of his own day, and introduced, as usual, the doctrine of forms. These now became patterns by which the supreme demiurge or craftsman has been guided in his work." End quote. So here we get the 4 causes. A lot is, and as he says, Aristotle makes a lot of this, perhaps more than is necessary. He says it seems to the reader that this bulks too largely at Aristotle's account. And I tend to agree that too much is made of these concepts of these causes. We don't really think all that much about them as that nowadays. He says one thing is that the elements, the composition of a thing is considered by Aristotle to be part of its cause. We don't really think that the stuff that something is made out of is really is really could be considered one of the causes of the thing. It's the constituent parts. That's fine. The house is made out of wood and metal and other things, but it's not really the cause of the house. It's just part of what the house is made out of. So that's kind of a semantic definition change. But also the idea here is that everything has all four of these causes in some respect, and one of those causes is the end for which a thing exists. So a house has a purpose. A builder builds a house for a purpose, and this is the telos. This is teleology, the study of the purposes of things. And people who have followed Aristotle's belief system have tended to support the idea that everything has a purpose. Everything has some intended role to play in the world. And here we get, the idea of the teleology of man. And many people adhere to this. Now, of course, there's a religious component here that people tend to think that God created mankind for some reason, and that reason generally to be like to know God, that we are created in order to get closer to and know and understand and bear witness to the glory of God. Perhaps that's some people's view of the purpose of man. But even absent that specific purpose, people still tend to believe that there's a sort of purpose for mankind. I know I've had conversations with other conservatives when I've said that I don't think there is a purpose to mankind in that way. Now, as I learn more and begin to refine my ideas, I begin to think that actually the purpose of mankind is to replicate our genetic code, that we are creatures that were created essentially by our DNA. We don't have DNA. DNA has us. We are created by our DNA in order to facilitate the longevity and replication of our DNA. But then what is the purpose of the DNA itself? Has no purpose, right? DNA is just a thing that arose by natural processes inevitably, right? There's a sort of necessity that given enough time, something along the lines of DNA would form just by the processes of evolution, the basic fundamental components of evolution. So, I don't really think that people have a purpose like that. I don't think that the world has a purpose like that. I don't think there's an end to things. And there are a lot of people who would disagree with that. So, in a sense, this study of causes is important, but I don't think we should just automatically take Aristotle's position at face value. And this is a problem that I think comes up a lot of times with people who study the philosophers, and they may take Plato and they may take Aristotle and they may take some combination of the two of them. There are disagreements between Plato and Aristotle, and I think sometimes those kind of get glossed over. But even acknowledging that, people will just sort of take Aristotle's view whole cloth, or they take Plato's view whole cloth and say, well, obviously this is accurate. These are the four causes of things. But I think you shouldn't be afraid to look at them with a bit of skepticism, look at Plato and Aristotle with a bit of skepticism that, these guys might not be correct about everything. So anyway, moving forward from there, he says, quote, Aristotle strongly criticizes Empedocles for trying to dispense with rational design, and is never weary of calling attention to the marvelous skill and economy of nature throughout his description of living things and their organs. The movement of the planets is likewise viewed as rational and purposive. In the history of science, there has been no more strenuous defender of final causes. Yet nature has no real existence as a personal force. Nature is a kind of unconscious art, situated within the living and growing things, an art which is careless of the individual, and aims only at the preservation of the specific type. Nature is present also in the lifeless elements, but here the tendency of each body to attain its natural situation, and remain there until it is forcibly withdrawn, takes the place of the quasi-purposive development of the form. And for the matter which provides the fabric of the bodies of living things, and the framework of the world in which they move, its changes are certainly governed in general by causal law. But Aristotle never speaks of an iron nexus of cause and effect, and seems to think that it is only in the outer region of the universe, which is most completely dominated by mind, that absolute uniformity of movement is to be found. By these views, he obtains liberty to interpret the cause of nature in terms of purpose, while making as few explicitly metaphysical assumptions as possible, and he probably hopes that the success and coherence of the explanation thus given will be taken as a guarantee of its validity. Doubtless, many modern workers in those sciences in which he was chiefly interested settle down in the end to some such view as his, and a philosophy which pronounces that this exquisitely designed world has existed for an infinite time, and that there is no emergence of new forms in response to a changed environment, is relieved from some tasks which would be onerous to modern science. In the end, you can either succeed in visualizing a world which is thoroughly permeated by a rational plan and yet was never planned, or you cannot. Aristotle is thoroughly convinced by his own picture, and goes so far as to claim that it is the very unconsciousness of nature's design that accounts for its superior accuracy when compared with human art. We do not find, then, in Aristotle's physical science much sense of contrast between the processes at work within living beings and those which operate in the lifeless world. Since he does not assume the movement of inanimate matter to be governed by inflexible laws, he does not have to answer the question raised by modern exponents of vitalism and mechanism, i.e., whether these same laws can, without invoking new factors, be made to give a sufficient account of living organisms and their changes. He does indeed assume, as will be seen, that there is a gulf fixed between the organic and the inorganic, for he attributes such processes as growth and reproduction to the presence of psyche, which he intends not as a mere name, but as the sign of a distinct mode of causation. But the opposition is not between spontaneity on one side and inflexible regularity on the other. End quote. So here we have a section that I think is a little bit hard to really grab hold of, and he says, the author here says, look, it says in the end you can either understand what Aristotle is talking about in visualizing a world that is thoroughly permeated by a rational plan and yet was never planned, or you cannot. He says Aristotle basically thought that if he explains everything in such a way that it makes sense, we'll just sort of accept that view. And he says that it's really the unconsciousness of nature's design that gives it its superior accuracy when compared to human art, which is conscious. So there's a sort of unconscious planning, an unintended planning that occurs in the world, which is a little hard to grasp hold of what exactly that means. He says he criticizes Empedocles for trying to dispense with rational design, and he's never weary of calling attention to the marvelous skill and economy of nature throughout his description of living things and their organs. So nature is skillful, nature is as intelligent, nature is rational, and builds things with skill and economy. And the planets, he says the movement of the planets is viewed as rational and purposive. So there's a sort of rationality and purpose and final cause. He says there's no more strenuous defender of final causes. In other words, ends, purposes. And yet, none of these ends and purposes are consciously designed. They're all sort of unconscious. What does that really mean? They're ends and purposes to which nothing has given them a purpose. Nothing has really decided consciously. Nature has not decided consciously that this is the purpose of this thing, and yet the purpose exists, which is a little hard to grab hold of. It seems to me that either there's an intelligent purpose, there's an intelligent reason for things being the way that they are, or else they are without purpose, and they are the way they are on account of necessity, that there is no other way they could be, or they're the way they are on account of chaos, or some combination of chaos and necessity, which would account for the way things are. But to say that there's a purpose, it seems to me that there must be some entity or some consciousness of some sort providing that purpose. And so it doesn't seem to quite add up to me. He says Aristotle never speaks of an iron nexus of cause and effect, but he seems to think that the outer regions of the universe, where everything is most uniform, most exact in its motions, is the area most completely dominated by mind. So in a way, mind and necessity are bound up together. Interestingly. And it almost seems as though the human mind, perhaps by failing to adhere exactly to rationality, has its deviations. But if our minds were more superior, they would be more rational, and by becoming more rational, we would all think the same thing, and we would all come to the exact same conclusion. Like when we all look at 1 + 1, we all come to the conclusion that it's 2. We all share the same ideas when those ideas are more rational. And the more superior and rational the human mind becomes, the more uniform it would hypothetically become until they would converge on a single, purely rational thought process. And that singular, absolutely rational, unified thought process is, by its nature, deeply deterministic, right? It would have to think a certain thing. It would have to follow certain rational laws by its profound rationality. It would just have a givenness to it. And so it almost seems like consciousness and rationality are in a way opposed to one another. And so the pure rationality of the outer universe is the pure consciousness of not consciousness, but mind. There's a sort of mind of pure rationality, and then there's the human mind, which has its own individuality, which to me seems to correspond with consciousness. And maybe consciousness is the wrong word, but a sort of individuality, because we're all thinking different things, and we're all thinking different things because we are not purely rational beings. So pure rationality is uniform, and that is the sort of domain of the stars and the moving planets. It's absolute deterministic rationality. And at any rate, it's a sort of interesting conception here, very different than what we would think of when we think of an intelligent design, that things are built by a consciousness to be a certain way. And that consciousness would include more than just the outer reaches of the universe, but that intelligent design would run through all things and all creatures. That everything would be subject to this intelligent design, not just maybe part of it in the sky. But interestingly, he says he doesn't assume that the movement of inanimate matter is governed by inflexible laws, and so he doesn't really have to explain whether humans and animals are all also subject to these inflexible laws, and whether our consciousness and whether our life, the fact that we're alive and move around and feel things and think things, is itself a product of these mechanistic laws. Because he's not really bound up in these sort of mechanistic laws, he doesn't really have to battle with that question. He just thinks that basically that living things have psyche, and psyche is just a part of the universe, and that's what explains the way that we are, and that's about as far as he gets on addressing that question of the deterministic, mechanistic, potential nature of living things. Psyche, of course, being another in mythology, another goddess. So let's move forward a little bit to where he talks about the different elements of reality. He says, quote, Aristotle is careful not to assume, without further explanation, the fact of movement, but to designate its cause. Every body, leaving the celestial region aside for the present, is either simple or composite. Every simple body has a natural place in the universe toward which it will naturally tend by rectilinear movement, so long as there is nothing to hinder it. On the other hand, it may be made to move by force in the opposite manner, i.e. away from its natural place. The natural movement of a compound body is that of the simple substance which predominates in its composition. Every body comes to rest when it has actually reached that part of the universe which is termed its natural place. Rectilinear movement cannot in any case continue ad infinitum. if, as is shown by various arguments, the whole universe is finite in extent. Like Empedocles, Aristotle assumes that there are four simple substances: fire, air, earth, and water. Fire and air, by nature, tend upwards, water and earth downwards, but it will be demonstrated A, that the earth is spherical, B, that it is at rest at the center of the whole cosmos, C, that the cosmos is also spherical, and by the expression up, we are to understand away from the earth in any direction toward the circumference. It is obvious that on this view, the lightness of bodies is no less a positive property than weight, that heavy bodies move downward in a straight line toward the center of the earth, and that the speed of the natural movement is proportionate to their bulk, are taken to be obvious empirical facts. Having thus developed the idea of natural and enforced spatial movements, Aristotle argues that it is reasonable to assume that there is likewise a fifth element to which circular rotation is natural, and which cannot, even by force, be made to move up or down, i.e., which is neither heavy nor light. Nor indeed can this element be subject to any enforced movement, since circular revolution has no contrary. And since it is repeated forcible movement which causes other bodies to collapse and decay, it will also follow that this substance alone is indestructible. But now the a priori arguments for the existence of such a body are, it is claimed, confirmed from other sources. In the first place, the ancient records of the East make it clear that the situation of the fixed stars has never changed for centuries, and the continuous, permanent character of the celestial movements is confirmed by our senses, Eudoxus having explained away the one apparent exception, namely the planets. Secondly, the unanimous tradition of mankind makes the celestial region the abode of divine powers, and language furnishes ready-made the name aether, expressing a body distinct from air and fire, though this has been misunderstood by philosophers. Lastly, it is for another reason convenient to assume that the outer region, which is occupied by the planetary spheres, is not composed of one of the four familiar elements. If it were filled, for example, with fire, this element would vastly exceed the remaining three in volume, and would surely, in the course of time, absorb them. It is much easier to assume that the four elements, which are constantly transmuted to one another, remain approximately equal in force. The hypothesis of aether is the foundation of a whole series of arguments, which are intended to show that the world is finite, that it is spherical in shape, that it was never created and can never be destroyed, and is not even subject to some rhythmical alternating process, but is engaged in a continuous movement or activity. End quote. So here we get the basic makeup of reality. We've got four elements, fire, air, earth, and water, and they all have their own natural movements. They all have their own natural place to which they tend. Water and earth move downward. Earth moves down more so than water, right? A rock will sink in water. Water sits on top of the earth. But so you've got earth is the heaviest, densest thing. It is the thing that moves, that belongs most clearly in the center of reality, of the universe. Then water also moves down, but doesn't move down below rock or earth. I think rock is really like the more fundamental form of the earth element. Dirt probably is considered sort of rock infused with a little bit of air and a little bit of moisture. It's probably not like the most fundamental form. Then you've got air and you've got fire, and of course air rests atop water, so air moves up and fire moves up even more so than air, because fire in air will continue to move up and rise above the air. So everything has a sort of natural place from the innermost center of the universe to the outermost edges of the universe, and there's a sort of constant churn amongst these four things. And then the heavens is made of another fifth element, which doesn't exist down here in the world, but exists only in the heavens, and its natural movement is not up or down. In other words, is not toward the center of the universe or away from it, but its natural movement is circular, and so it circles in these orbits around the outer edges of the universe. And interestingly, he looks back to history here, saying that the ancient records of the East make it clear that the situation of the fixed stars has never changed for centuries. So it seems as though Aristotle himself is looking at records that were ancient in his day, that went back centuries before, from lands to the east or lands to the southeast, which had older records of celestial movements and stars, and says that none of this has changed from then till now. The constellations and everything are the same in Aristotle's day as they were previously. So this presents the idea that the outermost sections of the universe are unchanging. They have their patterns, but those patterns don't change. They just keep doing the same circular, perfect motions over and over again for eternity. It's a nice view of the universe. Obviously, the universe is not exactly like this, but it's an interesting early scientific attempt at scientific understanding of the world, and an early use of rational explanations for the way things are, not turning directly to mythology, but in a sense having influence from mythology, and again having a sort of potential for rebuilding of mythology. So I think I'm not going to talk much more about that. That basically lays out the vision of the elements. And now I want to, that's the basics of his physics. Now I want to jump forward to a later part of the book where we get back to our old friends, ethics and politics. He says, quote, Aristotle regards ethics and politics as parts of a single inquiry, differing from science or philosophy proper in that it has a practical aim, namely the promotion and maintenance of human happiness. The mathematician and the physicist strive to learn about facts which they are powerless to change. The politician intends not only to understand man, but to change and educate him, and to learn how to make laws which will provide him with leisure and prevent him from coming to harm. Aristotle does not speak, as do some later members of his school, of a practical branch of philosophy, and would regard this expression as self-contradictory. And in the ethics and politics, he consistently assumes that he is not just theorizing about practical knowledge, but demonstrating it, as though he and his hearers were engaged in a joint practical enterprise. Practical wisdom, or phronesis, and politics, it does not matter which term we use, since it is held that they are identical, are to be seen embodied not in the university lecturer, but in the wise man or moral agent. This does not mean a total severance between philosophy and practical knowledge and the persons who possess them. It is often desirable, for the sake of practical efficiency, to gather the fullest information which the theorist can give us. And the first question which confronts Aristotle's politician is this: in what does human happiness or perfection consist? This question he can only answer by obtaining from the science of nature some knowledge of man's distinctive capacities. At the same time, nothing is further from Aristotle's mind to suggest that it is from physics that we learn how to make the distinction between right and wrong, just and unjust. The initial data of the political inquiry are provided by the opinions prevailing among unphilosophical men, and any theory which flatly conflicts with these should at once be rejected. However, it is obvious that there is much sincere difference of opinion about moral questions, even among those who have grown up in the same environment. The first business of the ethical philosopher must be to clarify the points at issue, and to bring out, wherever he can, the basic truth which underlies the apparently diverse views. Here it is that his knowledge of man's constitution and his place in the general order of nature may prove to be useful. Aristotle holds, then, that in the ethical sphere, the philosopher is more an interpreter than an authoritative guide of prevailing opinion. He should not try to influence other men on theoretical grounds in their estimate of what is just and good, but should do his best to ascertain what opinions are really held, not shirking the fact that these are by no means consistent. And he need not hesitate to express such opinions in his own terms, in order to free them from vagueness or inaccuracy. While he must not oppose a widely held view on a particular point of moral judgment, he does not owe the same respect to general principles enunciated by the plain man. End quote. So here we get an interesting contrast between philosophy and politics. He says practical wisdom, or phronesis, and politics are basically the same thing. Phronesis is the use of wisdom in the material world in dealing with circumstances and in dealing with other people. I think it might be a stretch to say that they're the same thing. Phronesis applies to craftsmen. Phronesis, I think, applies to other things than just politics. But essentially, practical wisdom is the application of wisdom to day-to-day affairs. But the point is that philosophy is something different. He says the idea of practical philosophy would be a contradiction in terms. Philosophy is by its nature regards Sophia, which is different than phronesis. And philosophy seeks to understand the way things are without trying to change them. Philosophy doesn't have any fundamental action involved in it. It's learning about the ways of the world, the ways of nature, and the ways of reality, the facts of reality, and the rational underpinnings of the world. It's not practical in its application. When it becomes practical, it's no longer philosophy. It's something different. It's politics. It's phronesis. So he says the first question of the politician, of Aristotle's politician, is what does human happiness or perfection consist? So what is the aim of the politician? If the aim of the politician is to bring about happiness for the city, happiness for himself and for his family and for other people, to bring about a state of happiness among mankind, the promotion and maintenance of human happiness, he says, what is human happiness? And that becomes the question that the politician needs to have some sort of a grasp of an answer to. And physics cannot tell us this, but physics and the study of nature can tell us a little bit about what man is. And when we understand what man is, what we are, and how we came to be, we can understand a little bit about ourselves. That can guide us, that can help us in understanding what our happiness looks like, what sort of things would constitute human happiness. And interestingly, he says that the initial data of the political inquiry are provided by the opinions prevailing among unphilosophical men. Any theory which flatly conflicts with these should at once be rejected. Now, this is interesting. You're in this case, in the case of politics and phronesis, you're actually going to the common man, the average unphilosophical person, and finding out what the prevailing opinions are amongst people about what happiness is, and that's your starting point. And you shouldn't propose any theory that flat out conflicts with what the common person understands happiness to be. If you propose a vision of happiness that is in conflict with what people believe, they're not going to happily accept this, and they're not going to rearrange their thoughts in such a way to believe that something that doesn't make them happy actually does make them happy, and they were too stupid to realize what happiness was. The common man is just not going to accept this, and it's probably not accurate because we think that the common people actually have at least some degree of practical wisdom in order to get through their day-to-day lives. And so they're not devoid of practical wisdom. Practical wisdom is necessary for every person. They may be devoid of philosophical understanding. They may not have studied philosophy or studied the nature of reality. They may not know the theories that underlie why things are the way they are, but they still have to have a sort of practical wisdom to get through life, to interact with other people. And so you shouldn't necessarily oppose the ideas of practical men, although you can kind of suss out the differences between different people's opinions, because opinions aren't all uniform. Even in the same city, there are differences of opinion. But the differences of, if there's something that most everybody believes, then it's generally true. If there's something where there's a distinct difference of opinion among people, these are in the finer points of ethics. Here you may have to come to a conclusion about which is correct. You may also have to accept that not everybody is going to have the same vision of happiness. People are different and they want different things. So you're never going to have this ironclad, pinned down answer as to what exactly makes people happy. You may have to provide different things to different people to help them achieve their own individual versions of happiness. So continuing from there, he says, quote, "The abandonment of Plato's belief in ideas or standards of justice, goodness, beauty, etc., which are accessible to a trained understanding, naturally brings Aristotle much nearer to common opinion, and restrains him from any remarkable innovation in this sphere. Yet he leaves the political philosopher with an important function to perform. He does not mean to reduce him to the role of question master in a kind of ethical brains trust in which those taking part are simple, respectable people. Some critics have objected to his introduction of his own philosophical theories into the ethics when he had guaranteed to keep them in the background. The charge is unfair and rests upon a false view of his distribution of work among the sciences. He supposes that the politician to be acquainted not only with the opinions of those whom he has to control and educate, but with the general results of scientific inquiry into man's mental and emotional capacities and his rank in the universe. And this should provide him with the key to the apparent differences of opinion, for these are, after all, the expressions of a common human nature. Modern thinkers, who are generally reluctant to come forward as guides to the end which ought to be pursued in life, hasten to assure us that Aristotle has mistaken the character of ethical inquiry, or that his treatise is not really based upon the method which he professes. But the fact is that he has a thoroughly consistent view, and that the ethics, though its social background is so remote from that in which we live, provides a refreshing contrast to the fatiguing modern analysis of the notions of right and good. It does not for a moment occur to Aristotle that one might engage in ethics and politics simply from theoretical curiosity, or that ethics itself should be distinguished from the deliberation of men engaged in the pursuit of their various purposes. And so he says repeatedly that the purpose of the lecturer and student is not merely to learn the truth, but to improve men and make them happier. In spite of this statement, Aristotle seldom preaches, and it is no part of his view to suppose that ethics will give men rules directing them how to behave in detail. He often repeats that the right course of action depends on many factors, which can only be estimated by intuition, such as the time, the circumstances, and the personality of the agent. The treatises are practical in the sense that they are meant to enlighten the politician and parent about the good which they should endeavor to produce, in themselves and in those who are committed to their charge. The whole inquiry is termed by Aristotle political, though it was he who gave the name ethics to that part of it which is specially concerned with the happiness of the individual. He has in view a double inquiry, wherein either part must involve the other. If we ask which mode of political organization is the best, it will be found that the only measure is the well-being of individual men. If we start by considering what is the best life for the individual, we shall in turn be obliged to take notice of his need for permanent association with others." End quote. So there's a lot in here that he points out how Aristotle has rejected Plato's belief in ideas or standards of justice, goodness, and beauty, etc. So right off the bat, you see, wait a minute, Aristotle is abandoning standards of justice, goodness, beauty, etc. Doesn't that make Aristotle sort of a relativist when it comes to these questions? And I think the answer is that yes, it does, to some extent, make him a relativist. And I think that's not something that should make us jump back in horror or fear or disgust at relativism, because I think people have a somewhat misunderstanding of relativism. The point is that Aristotle steps back a little bit from these sort of standards, but he says that the political philosopher is not just collecting all of the information of simple, respectable people in a sort of ethical brains trust and then regurgitating back, well, people say this and people say that, just sort of as an encyclopedia of common beliefs. That's not really what his role is. He actually has an important function to perform above and beyond that. He says here, critics have objected to how Aristotle has introduced his own philosophical theories when he's promised that these philosophical theories are really should remain in the background. But he says that's not really fair, because the politician is supposed to be acquainted with not only the opinions of the people that he has to educate or control or rule over or guide, but the politician also has to be acquainted with the general results of scientific inquiry into man's mental and emotional capacities and his rank in the universe. So the politician has to have some understanding of philosophy and science and nature to be able to make good decisions about things. It's not just a matter, like I said, of, well, people say this and people say that. He has to weigh the opinions of people against what is known about the nature of man and the nature of the universe. Those questions will inevitably come into relevance when making political decisions. He says that philosophical and scientific knowledge provides him with a key to the apparent differences of opinion. For these are, after all, the expressions of a common human nature. So we can understand people's differences of opinion when we understand more about human nature. And an important point here is that he does make the claim that there is a common human nature. These various expressions, these various differences of opinion point back to something common that people share. Maybe they have differing interests. Maybe people have differing circumstances. And their common human nature acts upon their differing circumstances to produce differing opinions, but their basis is let's say, for example, people are driven by self-interest. Now, there may be different degrees or amounts or points or kinds of altruism, but on the whole, people are driven by self-interest. And so people can disagree about things, but the disagreements are rooted in the self-interest of the disputing parties. Each person is going to take the opinion that most benefits them or most supports their pre-existing notions. So knowing a little bit about human nature is going to help the politician or the judge resolve differences of opinion. And another thing that's interesting here is he says that Aristotle often repeats that the right course of action depends on many factors, which can only be estimated by intuition, such as the time, the circumstances, and the personality of the agent. He says the treatises are practical in the sense that they are meant to enlighten the politician and parent about the good which they should endeavor to produce in themselves and those who are committed to their charge. So again, we see a sort of what would in the modern era be claimed relativism. If you say that there's a certain amount of knowledge about what is right and wrong that depends on intuition. It depends on your knowledge of the circumstances, that there's not a hard, fast rule of right and wrong, but what's right and wrong depends on, to some extent, on your personal feelings about things. Your intuitions have a role to play here. And I know I personally have gotten into online arguments with people, as we all do, about the nature of right and wrong. And I'm often accused of being a sort of relativist because I don't believe, I'm an atheist, and I don't believe that God has given us a universal objective standard of morality. And the argument, of course, goes that, without God, there's no source of morality. Why should anything be right or wrong? And that all of my opinions about right and wrong really amount to nothing more than my own opinions. That's it. My own personal opinions about what's right and wrong. And if somebody else has some other opinion, if somebody else believes that being a mass murderer is right, then me and this mass murderer really only share a difference of opinion. And there's no objective morality that says mass murder is wrong. It's really just someone's opinion. It's really just my opinion that it's wrong, but there's no basis for that other than my opinion. And my opinion and the opinion of the mass murderer both have the same weight. This is kind of the argument that's presented against relativism. And to some extent, I would say that there's truth to that. And that's just the way it is. We all have differing opinions, and the law is the imposition of the opinions of the powerful and the opinions of the majority, because the majority has power in its majority, in its numbers. It has a sort of power, and people share a general moral framework on account of their common human nature and on account of the society in which they've been brought up, the rules of conduct that they've learned in their youth. And so there's a general shared sense of morality, and law is the imposition and the calcification, the formalization of the shared opinions of the people who constitute the members of the society. So we all agree that mass murder is bad. So we make laws about it. And for those few persons who, for whatever reason, perhaps some sort of mental deformity, perhaps some sort of failure in the creation of the structure of their brain, have some mental defect that causes them to diverge from the common moral code that is imbued in our brains, hardwired in our brains by the evolutionary process. Just like people have physical deformities, people can also have mental deformities, and we have laws that say people who have mental deformities that cause them to believe things that are vastly out of line with the common beliefs of the people, or vastly out of line with the shared cultural norms that find their root in our common human nature. Those people are to be punished or to be put to death or otherwise removed from society. And maybe it's a matter of opinion, the difference between my belief and the belief of the mass murderer. But regardless of whether it's an opinion or not, regardless of whether there's some sort of objective moral standard that comes from some metaphysical transcendent source, the fact remains that for practical purposes, such people need to be removed from society. So, my opinion has more power than the opinion of the mass murderer, because many people agree with me and few people agree with him. And that's how it is. And that may bother some people. Oh, it's just a difference of opinion between you and the mass murderer. Maybe so, but if society agrees with me, then the mass murderer gets hung and put to death, and we all go on with our societies. We're not going to debate. We're not going to sit and debate whether or not mass murder is right or wrong. And we're not going to say it's okay for you to be a mass murderer because that's just how you feel about things. That's your opinion, and everyone's entitled to their opinion. So since your opinion is to be a mass murderer, what right do we have to tell you otherwise? That's not the result of dispute of opinions in a proper society. We don't believe that everyone has a right to their own opinion. If your opinion is destructive to society, then your opinion is not valid. And we don't require a transcendent moral standard. We just require that we have the power to prevent you from exercising your opinion in your life. That does sort of come down to a might makes right view of the world. The people who have the power, whether they're the majority or otherwise the strong, the powerful, impose their moral code on everyone else. And you can think that's right, you can think that's wrong, but that's the way of the world. And Aristotle seems to have a sort of agreement with that in a way, because he says that in many cases these are opinions and intuitions. I mean, what is an opinion but an intuition manifested into a doctrine? What the doctrine that your intuition drives you towards, that becomes your opinion. I believe this is so. I believe this is right. I believe this is wrong. That's my opinion, but my opinion is not contrary to my intuition. Right? My intuition tells me that this is right. Therefore, my opinion says that this is right. So opinions are bound in intuition. So as long as everybody, has, to the extent that everybody has similar intuitions, then everybody has similar opinions. And to the extent that people's intuitions differ, then their opinions differ. But the premise here is that there is a common human nature, and therefore our opinions and our intuitions will all somewhat coalesce. And the other factor here is that parents and politicians and teachers and leaders of communities have the capacity to shape their societies. The whole premise of the ethics is here's what the ends of society ought to be, and it's Aristotle's opinions based on his science of what our end should be. Our end should be happiness. And here is what humanity is. Here is what people are. Here is what people's happiness looks like. Here is the best form of happiness, the most rewarding form of happiness. This is what our end should be. Now, use your intuition to get us from where we are to happiness. So it's a balance, right? It's a balance of study and science and intuition and practical wisdom to get us to what we can agree on should be the end point. the end form of happiness that we're ultimately after. So it's more complex, I think, than just a simple question of, well, it's either the transcendent universal standard or it's everybody's opinion. That's a real simplistic dichotomy, I think. So one more section to read, the last section here. He talks a bit about happiness, or what we know as eudaimonia. And I always have to remind my listener that we're not really talking about happiness as we understand it. It's different. Eudaimonia is different. Happiness is not the best translation in my opinion, but it's the one that is constantly used. It's used by this author. So when we're talking about happiness in this section, we're talking about eudaimonia, we're talking about flourishing, we're talking about success, we're talking about successful societies, successful people, satisfied people, people with families, people who are contributing to their society, people who are productive. If someone finds happiness in destroying their society, that's not eudaimonia. That's not proper happiness. Proper happiness is eudaimonia. Proper eudaimonia is a happiness that is in concert with the happiness or the eudaimonia of their society at large. Good, productive, happy citizens with families who do the right thing and follow the law. This is eudaimonia. It's greater than happiness. It's flourishing. So here he says, quote, "All deliberate human action aims at some purpose or good, and all men are agreed in giving the name happiness or well-being to the chief good, which includes and surpasses the rest, and is never viewed as a means to some more ultimate good. Happiness or well-being is, at the same time, the ultimate standard of reference for all our moral judgments. It is, however, variously conceived by different classes of men. It is easy to see that it must consist not in idleness or sensuous enjoyment, but in good or virtuous activity. The philosopher, who is able to take account both of prevailing opinion and of scientific views of man's particular constitution and function, will be able to make the definition more specific. Man is partly an emotional and sensitive and partly a rational being, and the happiness of a creature thus constituted, so far as it can be described in terms suitable to all, will consist in two forms of rational activity. Firstly, in the free exercise of reason in theoretical study, and secondly, in the discipline of the emotions according to a rule or purpose formulated by reason. Accordingly, Aristotle distinguishes two virtues of the intellect, theoretical wisdom, or sophia, and practical wisdom, or phronesis. The former is necessary to human happiness as a component, the latter as a productive agent. All those intellectual capacities in virtue of which we aim at the true end, and are skillful in securing our aim, are subsumed under phronesis. Sophia and phronesis are virtues of the mind. They are produced by teaching, and they consist in knowledge of true rules, accompanied, in the case of phronesis, by skill in applying such rules intuitively to given situations. Sophia is concerned only with permanent truths, which man is powerless to change. From these intellectual virtues, we have to distinguish the virtues of character, justice, bravery, temperance, etc., which, according to Aristotle's view, are essentially correct emotional dispositions, produced by training or habituation begun in early youth. These virtues, each in its proper sphere, consist not in knowledge of true principles, but in habits of liking and aversion. Aristotle reaches the conclusion that the separation of virtues of character from phronesis, which is a virtue of the mind, is a logical, not a real one. In reality, moral virtue must be accompanied by phronesis, without which it would be blind, while phronesis can only be attained in conjunction with moral virtue. Aristotle claims, surely with some justice, that he has here taken a step beyond the intellectualism of Socrates, who, in the Platonic dialogues, tries to defend the view that a virtue such as courage is essentially a sort of knowledge. Few men, no doubt, will attain the higher intellectual virtue of Sophia, but the virtues of character are incomplete without phronesis, which is therefore necessary even to the average man. The recognition of what one ought to do in given circumstances is always regarded by Aristotle as an intellectual act, but an intuitive one, not a sort of calculation. And since it is important that each man should act with the right purpose in view, we cannot, as we do in the otherwise similar case of medicine, rely on the trained judgment of a few experts. Every man requires phronesis for himself. In this account of happiness, it seems at first sight that Aristotle has drifted rather far from popular notions, especially to readers accustomed to the English term happiness and its equivalents in other modern languages, for these by no means represent the Greek eudaimonia. However, Aristotle concedes that external goods, wealth, etc., do affect happiness in the sense that the lack of a certain provision of them, which need not be large, may render full happiness unattainable. But he refuses to regard them as belonging to the essence of happiness. Besides this, it is evident that Aristotle distinguishes more sharply between happiness and pleasure than a modern thinker would do. A valuable section of the Ethics is devoted to a psychological study of pleasure, in connection with a controversy within the Academy in which Eudoxus, during his visit there, played a leading part. It is maintained that pleasure is an external sign and accompaniment of successful activity, whether of the mind or the senses. It shows that the faculty is healthy and that it is being exercised under good conditions. It should follow from this, incidentally, that the virtuous activities, intellectual and moral, are intrinsically pleasant to anyone who has succeeded in making them habitual. At the same time, pleasure is only an external sign of the goodness of the activity, not a factor which helps to make it perfect. And therefore Eudoxus was mistaken in regarding pleasure as the end or good, and the activity a mere means to its attainment. End quote. So here we get an interesting thing. I want to talk specifically about the end here, about Eudoxus' visit to the Academy, and a controversy that erupted as a result of his visit, where Eudoxus claims that pleasure is really the end or the good, and virtuous activity is a means of attaining pleasure. Whereas the members of the Academy believed that virtuous activity was the end, and that pleasure was an effect of that, a sign of that, sort of a symptom of being virtuous and living a virtuous life. But the living a virtuous life is the point, and pleasure is just a side effect of it. The premise here being, I think, that even if pleasure was not a side effect of the virtuous life, we would still have the end or the objective of living the virtuous life. Now, I almost want to agree with Eudoxus here, and that's probably an unpopular position. But I think that if it were unpleasant, if it were something that didn't feel rewarding in some way, for us to behave in a virtuous manner, it would be hard to argue that that's what we should do. We like to say that virtue is its own reward, but taking a more materialistic view, where I tend to think that the objective of human activity, it boils down to genetic reproduction in a real kind of materialistic way, I guess. Pleasure is a signal that we're doing the right thing. Like if you eat something that your body needs, it tastes good. And like sweet things, like fruits and stuff, taste good because in the wild, in the environment in which we evolved, they were somewhat hard to acquire. They're not everywhere. Like leaves are everywhere. And leaves and basic vegetables and stuff, might provide some nutrients that we need, but they're in abundance. They tend to be more in abundance. And so we don't have this sort of constant craving for vegetables, because basic vegetables they're in a greater abundance than sugar. Sugar is harder to find, although we need it. We need sugar. We need some of that, the contents of fruits. We crave them more because they're harder to find. And so, like, sex feels good because we have to do it. And so the pleasure is the motivating factor. We're after pleasurable things. We're after fruits and things. We're after sex. We're after health. We're after things that feel good. They feel good. It's an emotional hardwiring for us to pursue things that feel good in order to achieve our objectives. The evolutionary process doesn't provide us with a negative response to things we need, because we wouldn't pursue them and we would die off. Any species that had a natural aversion to sexual activity would not procreate and would not last and would go extinct. We have a natural inclination toward the things that are good for us. So you could say, well, the end is, the objective is to procreate and not to pursue the pleasure of sex. But from a biological standpoint, right, we don't necessarily think in terms of what's best for our genetics. We think in terms of what's pleasurable. We're after pleasure. We're chasing pleasure. And nature has constructed us in such a way that when we pursue pleasure, our genetic objectives are fulfilled. When we pursue avoiding injury, right? Injury is painful. And it's painful because it decreases your capacity to procreate. It decreases your capacity to survive long enough to procreate and duplicate your genetic code. Injury is bad for your DNA and the longevity of your DNA. That's why it hurts. It doesn't hurt in and of itself. It doesn't hurt because injury has a sort of fundamental badness to it. It hurts because it's injurious to your DNA and its replication potential. So we pursue the avoidance of injury for the ultimate end of, again, genetic reproduction. All of the things that we pursue, all of the drives that we have, avoiding injury, being healthy, feeling good, eating food, eating good food, eating healthy food. Although in the modern era that's been kind of manipulated by industry and the capacity to fill the supermarket with sugary snacks, but in an evolutionary environment, in the wild in which we evolved, the pursuit of pleasure is what kept us alive. The pursuit of a healthy body, sexual relations, companionship from other people, these are the things that kept us alive. And so I guess it's not just an accidental side effect. The argument from the Academy is that it just happens to be pleasurable to do good things, to be virtuous, happens to be pleasurable, but it's just a side effect. But we're built in such a way that it is in our best interests to pursue pleasure. The pursuit of pleasure has the side effect of advancing our genetic code. So from our perspective as beings, as humans, we're after the pursuit of pleasure. From our genetic code's perspective, our genetic code is after replication. And our genetic code creates the pursuit of pleasure in us. But we're not the final deciders. So we pursue pleasure. Our end is pleasure. And the ends of our genetic code is advanced along the same lines of pursuit. And again, this comes back, I think, to my argument that virtuous activity is pleasurable because virtuous activity enhances our survival. Virtuous activity enables us to have relationships with other people, productive relationships, enables other people to trust us, to be willing to work with us, to help us. We help them and they help us, and everybody's genetic code benefits as a result. Societies exist to advance our genetic code, and our virtues enable us to participate in society. Everything comes back to the genetics. So I would say that virtue is a step along the path toward genetic success, and pleasure is a step along the path to genetic success. And so neither of them are really the end from a really fundamental perspective. Pleasure is not the end. Virtue is not the end. Happiness is not the end. Flourishing is not the end. A long life is not the end. Having children is not the end. Genetic replication is the ultimate end. And a life that facilitates genetic replication is the end for us as humans, from the human perspective, as opposed to just the genetic perspective. From the human perspective, a life that facilitates genetic replication, which looks like a virtuous, happy, pleasurable life, is the end. And all those various things are components of that. Pleasure is a component. Virtue is a component. Material wealth is a component. Health is a component. All of these things are components of the aggregate life. The aggregate life that has all of these constituent components is eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is the end for us. It's not virtue. It's not pleasure. It's not any of those things. It's eudaimonia. It's happiness. That's the ultimate end. And the pursuit of pleasure is, I think, a more fundamental component than the pursuit of virtue, because the pursuit of pleasure is something that even a moron can grasp hold of. Even a deviant can grasp hold of the pursuit of pleasure. And that is just so fundamentally biologically tied at a more cellular level. The pursuit of pleasure is tied to eudaimonia in a way that I think is more fundamental to all living things, right? I mean, an animal doesn't pursue virtue, but it still pursues pleasure because it's more fundamental biologically. The pursuit of pleasure is more fundamental to genetic replication than virtuous activity is. Virtuous activity is maybe a quote-unquote higher component. It's really distinctive. It's a distinctive component that is distinctive to humans because of our societies and the way our societies work and the way our brains work. It's something that's more or less unique to humans. But the pursuit of pleasure is biologically fundamental. Anyway, that's going to wrap up my show for today. Thanks a lot for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.